Hello everybody, Volen here, in pursuit of art. I wanted to make a quick video for you guys this week and talk about anatomy, gesture drawing, and figure drawing. I had a question on my Facebook from Kurt Jeremy asking about anatomy resources, and I'm never sure if I just answer that directly, if I won't be doing the person more harm than good. Reason being that when people say anatomy, really what they mean is that they just need to learn to draw people. I know that when I was first starting out, when I was first learning, I started learning anatomy so early, I couldn't even draw the various shapes that I was learning. So I would be subscribed to like medical channels, and I'd be looking at medical students learning all the bone tuberosities. I used to know all the different names for all the different, I've forgotten those almost 95% now. It just makes absolutely no difference to what we're trying to do. For the most part, unless you're a professional that is only doing characters, you're sculpting them very, very often, and you need to, your work basically is distinguished by the fact of anatomical accuracy, really, unless you're at that stage, which is probably at the 95 percentile, like you've put in 5-6 years maybe of work and you're like really high up there. I would say that there's really absolutely no point in getting stuck in those minutiae details. So when I was learning anatomy, I couldn't even draw the shapes of anatomy. So when I was watching the videos, I couldn't even possibly, I remember just the video for the scapula popped up and I'm like, oh my God, I can't possibly draw this too. Because at that time it was still, I was doing the basics at such a low level that just getting the alignments correctly and just actually even understanding the purpose of different types of drawings, that was just too advanced for me. I couldn't really let myself simplify stuff because I would be entangled in my mind and, oh, this has to look like what it actually looks like. Basically, I was so far below the level for learning anatomy that it's not really harmful. I mean, I still remember, I still use all of this stuff, but really I wasn't able to use it until years later. So this is why when someone asks me about anatomy, I'm sort of reluctant to answer unless I can like see their work and actually see that they're at the point that they should be learning that stuff. Because if I just tell them, oh yeah, just go on this website or just get this book or just watch this course, they might then know anatomy, but they still can't draw people. So it pretty much, the question is defeated. Like the actual question isn't what are good resources for anatomy, it's how to draw people. So I'm gonna make, this video is gonna be a quick sort of walkthrough of the different stages of drawing people and when I think you should be learning anatomy. Again, you can just learn that earlier on. You can sort of intertwine it with your studies, but just make sure that you're actually hammering on the basics, and that anatomy studying, if you're a beginner, could just be a tiny fraction of that. So let's say 10% of all time spent on drawing people is anatomy, 90% is gesture drawing, figure drawing, and just figuring out weights of the figure, perspective, where everything, proportion, all of that stuff. Really, that's critical and that's key. And the anatomy is the extra 10% that separates you. So if you can do the 90%, the 10% after isn't that important. A lot of movies, a lot of games, a lot of the characters in those are really not 100% anatomically correct, but no one cares because they look like people, they walk like people, talk, they do everything. So the 90% is there. The extra 10% is not that important. So let me make the distinction for you guys and just sort of show you the stages of drawing a person. So the first stage is called gesture drawing, and the gesture drawing really is just a quick way to position masses and to just see how the figure distributed. What is the action? Capture it, and just also make sure that all the major masses are in the correct proportion. When you're just doing something with line, it's a lot easier to make big corrections. So the simpler something is, the easier it is to make large corrections. Now this goes for absolutely everything. My girlfriend, she was recently writing an essay and I was just looking at it and she was 95% done. And then she was looking at if she should be rearranging things. And the thing is that this is so far late in the game that changing anything involves so much effort. So imagine if you found out that you have a proportion problem, but you've gotten to the point where you've started into the figure drawing or even into the anatomy now. So you find out at this stage over here that like the back is way too long, or your pelvis is way too short, or you have a proportion problem. Now, if you had figured that out on stage number 1 over here, that problem would have been resolved in about 3 seconds. Just lengthen a line, that's it. And you can see it more clearly. So if you teach yourself to be able to look at this and not feel like, oh my God, I'm the worst on the planet, I can't go beyond this, like this is all I can do. My stickmen aren't even stickmen because they have like little circles on their butts. If you're able to actually go beyond and think of these as tools and practice them for the purpose that they're intended for, which is to figure out the proportion, again, figure out the masses, figure out how the weight is distributed. If you can do that, then really you're 80% of the way there. This looks like the most basic of things, but actually this is some of the most important stuff. And you being able to actually be okay with the fact that if someone looked at it, they'd think you suck and will absolutely never be able to do anything of any importance in the world. If you're able to accept that and just think of what you're doing as a tool that will be built upon, then you're doing absolutely amazing, because the next stage that's coming up, the figure drawing that builds upon this, you are well prepared for it. A good name for you to check out for gesture drawing is Glenn Vilppu. This is how you spell his name, Vilppu. And I think he used to be a painter. He used to work for Disney Studios, I think, as well. He used to give workshops, and I think he was training animators. So this guy is really, really advanced, and he had courses that I watched again so early on when I was starting that I didn't even know what to do with them. Like the level of the teaching, again, as in with learning anatomy, is just so far beyond what I was ready for that it took me years to actually realize what the guy's showing. But what he was showing is figure drawing, how to position the figure, how to do all that stuff, making the distinctions between basic simple shapes and then building the anatomy on top of that. And that's really what I'm showing you guys here, is that first you're making a very simple structure that you are then, if I actually show you this, you can see this is how it begins and this is how it ends. You're making a very simple structure, just really as a means to communicate to yourself where the major masses and forms are going to be. Really, no one needs to understand the drawing at this point. They will understand it at this point, but this is for you, so your brain can figure out where stuff is. Like for me, it's the most important thing always to make something look just a bit three-dimensional. I can't think 2D. I can't see stuff yet. I'm sure later on I'll probably pick that up as well. But for now, when it's completely flat, I just can't see it. So I need to give my brain hints of dimension, and I need to make it see, okay, this is actually not flat, this is round, this is this big, this is this bulky. So it really helps me. So this is how it begins, and it's really only to communicate to yourself, this is where the major masses are going to be, this is where I'm going to build the structure later on. So you start with this, you end with that. And on top of that, you can then refine, and that's when you hammer in the anatomy. So let's go to stage 2. So this is the difference between gesture drawing, and gesture drawing can be as simple as this, really. This is pretty much complete. Once you have this correct, and if it's right, you move on to the next step. So figure drawing, I would suggest, is, again, those definitions are loose and they're sort of mine. This is how I think about it. I don't know what the academical definition of all this stuff is supposed to be, because figure drawing people also include anatomy and that, but I would say just for ease for us to understand what we're after, I would simplify it to just something like this, which is the basic forms being put in and them being described in 3 dimensions. So something like this doesn't really necessarily have anatomy on, but when someone's asking me about anatomy, this is potentially what they would mean. But if you actually look at these, they don't really have anatomy. I mean, they have form, and this is where, to me, gesture drawing is. So they have the actual human form, but they don't have anatomy. You can't see over here the overlap of the pectoral and the deltoid. You can't see the bicep and how you couldn't see any of those small distinctions. You can't see the coracobrachialis and the brachialis and the medial head of the trike. You can't see any of those. So really there is no anatomy. You only just have form. And this is the second stage. This is the figure drawing. Again, this is pretty much the figure described in 3 dimensions, but it's only in simplified form. I think this is an awesome example of it. So this is, but you can see the person is showing you exactly the level of thought that is necessary for this stage, which is basic, simple 3D shapes and forms, and you are combining those into basically a mannequin. So this becomes your template then that you will then start, and you will begin putting in the pectoral, putting in the other one, then you have the rib cage, then you build on top of that, you'll have the latissimus dorsi, then you'll have the serratus, then you'll have the external oblique, then you move over here, then you'll hammer out the rectus femoris, vastus medialis, vastus lateralis, all the fascia, all of that stuff. You start hammering that on at a stage that most people are probably either convinced that they've completely failed at figure drawing because they've only gotten to this stage over here, just a gesture like, oh, this is all I can do. Well, that's great. If you can do that, then perfect. Then begin simplifying stuff. Then once you are able to make the more complex simplified model, then you start building anatomy on top of that. And you can see that in this drawing here as well. The person is pretty much showing that once you have this shape, once this is with sound structure and well built, then you start building the anatomy on top of that. Really, it's 3 stages to building a figure. It's really every single stage is building upon the next. And if any one of those stages is not prepared, so for instance, if at this stage, once the gesture would have been established, so if the figure began with something like this, and this was all there was, once this stage is complete, then once you block it out with the 3D forms on top of that, and once those are correct, then they're also the correct proportion, which is not just length. So when you're doing gesture drawing, really all you have to match is just the lengths of the different elements. That's all you have to match. Once you have those in place, then you're really on top of that, you're building then the sort of the depth as well. So you need to match also now the thickness of all the forms. So once those are blocked out in cylinders, and once this is all complete, then you really move on to just building the anatomy on top of that. So like this is the arm, and then you would start, okay, so the pectoral would be over here, would move over there with the deltoid, deltoid's over here, trapezius goes behind, attaches onto the neck, onto the clavicle, merges over here, deltoid, and then you begin, that's when you build the anatomy over the top. Okay, so now we get to anatomy. And anatomy is pretty much the thing that takes up about 80% of the time, and it's actually about 20% of the work. What that means is that the other 80% hinges completely upon your completion of the gesture and the figure, like we talked about before. And let me just make a quick note here, like this is only one way to work. Once you're pretty confident in actually getting good figures, you can just do it with tone. You don't have to actually bother with gesture. You don't have to do the blocking in of simple shapes. So basically that will become almost automatic for you. Your brain will have such a good map of 3-dimensional form of figures that really you could just use tone. You could just begin with line, but not even do the gesture thing, but just sort of begin even describing anatomy in the first stages if you want to, just to get your brain thinking about specific things you want to be showing. So really there's no one way to do stuff. As with everything, this is just a sort of recipe that could hopefully work for almost everyone. You can see all the other stages are pretty much the majority of the work, and this final stage is the one that just gives the figure its appearance, but this takes about 80% of the time. So this means that if any of these are wrong, and this is 80% of the work, even though it only takes about 20% of the time. So you get, really quickly you can get from here to here. And then from here to get to here, that's another 80. That takes longer than any of the previous stages. So you have to make sure that those are correct. Once those are done, then you're pretty much okay and set up to successfully put in the anatomy. Now, one thing I want to do is I want to just, for a second, just underplay the importance of anatomy. It's because we call it anatomy, we study it as anatomy, meaning that we look at all the muscles, we look at all the attachments, origins, and all that stuff. But you have to know that when you're actually drawing people, most often you're going to be drawing them clothed, of course, because most people don't walk around naked. And I don't know if that makes for a better or a worse world. But anyway, look at this. And I think that's a good example of what the difference is between what people are actually like and what anatomy and how we think of it is like, the way we're taught and the way we learn it. So you can see the teacher over here pointing to the insertions of muscles, just diagrams of all the different muscles, where they attach, all of that stuff that we're familiar with when we're learning anatomy. Check out the actual model now. Probably none of that stuff that's been shown is actually showing up on her. You can see the bony landmarks, so you can see the skeleton poking through, but you really can't see any of the actual muscle. You can see it on some, let's say, but 80% of the muscles are just going to be covered up by fat, by fascia, by other tissue, by skin. So really you very rarely get to see a person looking like an anatomical chart, which means that, again, the gesture and the figure are going to be the most important. 80% of the work, 20% of the time. And anatomy is only the thing that comes on top. Now let me show you another thing real quick. So this is from God of War 1. This is Kratos. Now check this out. I never knew this when I was playing the game because I really wasn't doing anything related to what I'm doing now, but it never occurred to me to think that Kratos doesn't have anatomy. So me as a regular, untrained person that doesn't look for any of this stuff, I never even thought about that, okay? That was just, I wouldn't have even known to notice. So most people that are not looking for art, that are not really educated in any of this stuff, most often, if it looks correct, if the gesture and the figure are correct, they probably wouldn't be thinking about if the coracobrachialis is inserting in the right place. Check out the baddies as well. Very stylized anatomy. I mean, all of them is just pretty much just basic forms stuck together. And check him out. Really, all he is just a figure drawing, and that's pretty much about it. Just very basic indications of like all the biggest thing that you might find on the human body, just like the spine, pretty much. That's really all there is to it. Now check out number 2 and 3. Over here, anatomy is drastically changed. Now you can see that this figure has anatomy compared to this one. But the irony being, or the point being, that this one, the first game, spawned the other 5, 6, 10, however many games there are now. So really what that means is that anatomy isn't really the determining factor, but the character, the story, and everything else, and just getting the 80% of the work, again, the gesture, the figure, 80% of those, if they are correct, the anatomy, really, that's, to most people, that's an afterthought. I mean, for us, we recognize it, we know it's important because it gives you that. The final 20% are really what sets your work apart. But you really need to hammer out the first 80% before you get to the point where you can actually separate yourself and sort of, in a way, even be deserving of learning that higher level stuff. You need to put in the work in the first 80%. But you can see Kratos looks a lot more lifelike. Another example is, I can remember where I got this from. I really don't know the guy's name, but just amazing anatomy, amazing characters. I've seen other stuff from him. Anatomy is pretty much what gives the figure like the awe that you get when you look at it. Just that essence of realism, like that thing that makes you think, wow, this is like a real character. Like he carries weight. It makes you it gives credibility to your figure. It gives credibility to your character. That's why it's important. Like when you look at this guy, it's like lifelike. It seems like he could exist, and not only that, just everything about him makes you think that this is somehow a character with a story, and your anatomy is telling the story of the character without even him saying anything. You can make assumptions about what this guy's life has been like and what he's all about. And if the anatomy was wrong, let's say that the pectoral didn't insert in the right place, maybe. Let's say that happened. Would that matter to most people? Absolutely not. Would it matter to artists and other people that look for that stuff? Yeah, they might notice. But again, does it actually matter? Now, that's a question just sort of left up to you. But what I'm saying is that if you're lacking in the first 80%, then maybe divert your attention from doing where the scapula, what the rotation of the scapula is when you raise your arm. Maybe instead of learning that, maybe focus on the first 80% and really get that down first, because to 95% of the people on the planet, they would never know if any of that stuff was wrong. They would only focus on the other things. So first things first, right? So let's have a look at some quick examples and wrap this up. So again, the model is most often going to have just a lot of fat, skin, all kinds of things, just covering up all the anatomical charts that you spend so much time learning. And another example, I'm not picking on anyone, but another example of why gesture and figure are so important is because no amount of anatomy resolves a mistake in proportions, let's say. So with this guy's head, no amount of anatomy and no amount of knowledge of where stuff goes and where all the muscles originate from, none of that stuff is going to compensate for the figure just looking weird. So this is the 80% have not been done, and then you begin working on the 20% afterward. So if you just spent a couple of minutes to just resize the head, check it with the proportions of the body, figure out if the whole figure is how it should be done, then you can start putting in the anatomy, then you get the impact. Just the anatomy, the last 20%, putting it before the first 80%, it doesn't really give you the same result. It just doesn't work like that. Okay, so we had a look at anatomy. We talked about why it's not as important as you might think. We also had a look at the character after that and thought about why it's important actually. And this is some of Scott Eaton's work. I would suggest that you look him up as well. He's pretty much the master of anatomy, is the way I think of him. And you can just Google him and just have a look at his images. I mean, the guy's a sculptor. He does all this stuff in ZBrush, and his anatomy is pretty much impeccable. I mean, everything that you see on his work is probably something that you could just use without even thinking about it, just without having to double check if it's. I think the guy has really done his research. So just looking at anything from him, and you can also just see that even though he does anatomy incredibly well, he also has, I think, just like Rodin, the sculptor, I think he just has a really cool gestural approach to sculpting and to just doing anatomy. So it really doesn't sort of, in a way, overemphasize it, but uses it more as a tool. Just amazing work. Scott Eaton, this is how you spell his name. And to have a look at more of images of his écorché, you can just type this in, écorché, and then Scott Eaton, and you can probably get some good turnarounds with this thing. It's actually an app, so you can have a look around the figure. It's an amazing thing to be able to look at. Just a great reference. I mean, there's really everything that's on that figure you could use as reference for whatever it is you're doing. And again, the 80-20 thing is pretty much fully enforced. The very flowing gesture. One other thing is that normally with each stage, going from gesture to figure to anatomy, with each stage your figure is going to stiffen up a little bit. So with the gesture, normally you want to overemphasize a little bit what the position is actually going to be like. Then with the figure, it's going to tighten up a bit when you put in the 3D forms, and then with the anatomy, you might tighten it up further even still. So to do something like this, it's an incredible amount of skill. Now you can check out some of Proko's videos. I just had a look on his channel. There's loads of stuff on anatomy, on gesture drawing, on figure drawing, and there's also been critiques, and with Marshall Van Druff as well. Really awesome guy. I would really suggest that you have a look at his channel, and it's probably going to be a lot of useful things for you over there just to get a look at. This is simplifying figures. Glenn Vilpo, the instructor I talked about earlier, he's also done a little demo over here, so you can have a look at some of his stuff. Really useful to just get now a practical introduction to all of this stuff rather than just me talking. Okay, thank you very much, guys. I hope that was useful to you. I'll see you around.